Good morning and welcome to the EMS Deployment Deep Dive Westcoast webinar. My name is Michael Weeks and I'm the Cloud Service Desk Team Lead here, and I specialise in Office 365 and EMS. So what we'll be covering today is why use EMS, the new versus the old portals, device management and policies, conditional access and deployment considerations. So why use EMS? So EMS is a very broad security system as well as device management platform that Microsoft have implemented. So you can do things from mobile device management to the application on the mobile device management, various PC management, security updates, and various things to protect your customers' data. So, for example, it enables users to utilize their personal devices or corporate devices without risking any security. So it's got a very simplified registration where you download an app, log in with your Office 365 credentials, and the device is now enrolled in Intune. It also synchronizes the corporate data across multiple devices. So if they've got a laptop, a desktop, a mobile phone, you can synchronize it across all devices, and also you can encrypt them for extra security. It also unifies their environment. So if you've got any on-premise hardware and any other cloud-based devices or software, you can manage them just within the Intune portal. It's also got various settings for VPN configurations, wireless profiles, security certificates that you can manage all through the one portal. As well as that, it allows you to protect your data, which in this age is very, very important. So you can remotely wipe devices, whether it's just the corporate data or the personal data as well. You can identify which devices have also been compromised, and you can make sure they meet compliance so they are secure. So pretty much most devices are supported by EMS, whether it's any iOS devices, Android devices, Microsoft tablets, desktop PCs, laptops. Majority things are supported. There are a few which have limitations to it, which is mainly using older operating systems such as Windows 10 or any out-of-date versions of iOS or Android, but generally speaking, Intune can manage all of them. So, new versus old portals. So the previous portal of Azure was using Microsoft Silverlight, which is extremely out of date now, and Microsoft are decommissioning it. So they've moved it over to the Azure portal. Now, for a lot of people, this can be slightly confusing. However, it's laid out in a very easy and manageable way to use compared to the old one. So, for example, this is where in the old portal you do compliance policies, and then this is how you do device enrollment. Whereas within the new Azure portal, compliance policies is literally just device compliance and then policy, and then device enrollment is essentially automatic for Windows-based devices, and on mobile phones you just download the company portal app, sign in with the Office 365 credentials, and the device is there. So it's a lot easier to use than the old classic portal, but again, there is a little bit of confusion with where things are located in the Azure portal, but we can assist if you need help with that. The only thing that hasn't changed between the two is Azure Groups. So these are used to group devices for specific users in specific departments. You can do it from a user level. So if you've got a sales team and an IT team, you might want them to have two different policies. This is all done in Azure Groups, and this has not changed between the classic Intune portal and the new one. So moving on to the device management and policies. So, for example, Intune allows you to have reporting on what type of devices are enrolled. So, for example, here we've got 34 devices in total, 1 Android, 1 iOS, 31 Windows devices, and 1 Windows Mobile. You can then go down to exactly the device name, whether it's a corporate or personal device, if it meets compliance, operating system, OS versions, and there's a lot you can drill down to into it. For example, this is a Surface Pro that we've got registered within Intune. It gives you the desktop name, who it's actually assigned to, serial numbers, when it was last registered with Intune, storage spaces, various options that allows you as an administrator to be able to see what devices users are using. whether they're corporate or personal, as well as, for example, how much storage space is left. The same with mobile devices as well. So the example we've got is an iPhone. It gives you who's the user is assigned to it, whether it's personal or corporate, serial numbers, telephone numbers, manufacturers, all the other details you can get about the device is all manageable within Intune. So, moving on to the compliance policies. So, this is the first step when you configure EMS for deploying it. Compliance policies are basically policies you put in place to say whether the device is allowed to join your corporate network or not. So, for example, in the screenshot that we've got there, require a password to unlock mobile devices. You can require it to be enforced upon the device. So if I've got a Windows phone and it doesn't have a password on, it will be marked as non-compliant and cannot join Intune. So that means until the users fix this, so setting a password on it, it won't be allowed to join the corporate domain. More examples of this is you can even go into the password length, the minimum minutes of inactivity before it's required again, if it's expiring, whether the device needs to be encrypted. There's all these various options that you can put for, again, Windows 10, Windows 8, any mobile devices, tablets. You can all enforce these custom policies to fit your requirements. The next step after this is the device configuration. So this is the policies that are enforced on the actual device to say what it needs to do. So for example, we've got here a policy for the sales team and a policies for the service desk team. Now the sales guys may need to have a more restrictive password because they're going to be on the road, whereas the service desk guys might need a less restrictive one because they have admin tasks that need to be done. There's a lot of different settings that are available, and in the screenshots that you've got 22 settings that be configured for general, there's 14 for passwords, and so on. There's a lot of different settings that can be configured, and they can be used to meet compliance if you are required to. So an example is a password configuration for the device. So in here you can make sure that the password's required, what type it's got, so whether it's just numeric or alphanumeric, the length of it, number of sign-in failures before what device is wiped, whether you allow simple passwords or encryption when it joins Azure AD, Windows Hello. There's a lot of different options, and this is just for passwords. So it's definitely worth testing these before you actually roll out to users. Otherwise, you might find that you'll get some complaints because it's either too restrictive or not restrictive enough. So the reporting side of EMS is generally quite good. So you can report on actions the devices have taken. So if someone's trying to remove it from Intune to try and steal corporate data, reports will show you that if anyone's tried to do this, as well as if any devices are conflicting with the policies and have errors. So for example, if you've got a user in the sales policy and the service desk policy, they're going to throw up an error because the configurations are different for both these policies, and you can't have one device with two password policies. So Intune allows you to explore various reporting on all the devices, on all the users, how they're being managed, whether they're updating correctly, whether they're compliant. There's a lot of different options on here, and they can be customized to suit your customers' needs. So, moving on to conditional access, which is probably the smallest part of the presentation but has the biggest impact. So, conditional access essentially says whether someone can access your corporate data in a set location. So, for example, if we've got a user who's working from home, but the policy is set up to not allow people outside of the corporate network, they'll be denied access, or you can set it so it enforces multi-factor authentication. The same with specific devices. You can set it so any device that's not domain joined or not compliant can't access any of the Office 365 services such as Exchange or SharePoint. The same with applications. If you can only allow applications to be run inside your corporate network and not outside, you can block it or again enforce multi-factor authentication. The big section around this is the IP range for locations. We have a lot of customers who want users to be able to have the freedom to do what they need to for Office 365 whilst in the corporate network, but then, for example, block internet cafes or fast food restaurants with Wi-Fi areas like that, we obviously want to restrict because they're unsecured Wi-Fi's and the corporate data could be at risk. So again, you can enforce multi-factor authentication just for that extra layer of security, or you can completely block it depending on the customer's requirements. So an example here is essentially when the user tries to access their email outside of their corporate network, essentially the device connects with Office 365, which says, hold on a minute, we need to check with Intune that this is okay. It sends the request to Intune, which double checks that the device is enrolled, encrypted, got a password set, and it's not jailbroken or rooted. It then sends it back to the device to say, yep, you can access this, don't worry about it, and then it lets you in. Another example here is we've got a user who's on a beach somewhere who's trying to access Office 365. He's going to be denied, whereas the other user is at the corporate network, he's going to be granted. So you can be very specific with the IP ranges and who's allowed to actually access Office 365 services outside of the corporate network. Again, you can also restrict some within the corporate network if necessary. So the main deployment considerations for EMS revolves relatively around the operating system of the devices. There are a few other areas that you need to explore as well. So again, what sort of devices are they using? Is bring your own device in use? Do they currently use Office 365? What operating software is being used? And how do they authenticate? And finally, who is the target audience here? These are the key areas that you need to look at before deploying EMS or suggesting it to a customer. A certain level of discovery needs to happen beforehand to ensure that it is right for them. So, what type of devices are the customers using? So, supported operating systems for Windows in EMS is 7, 8 and 10. Mac, Windows Phone, iOS devices, Android devices, and the Microsoft HoloLens. However, please be aware that Windows 7 is slowly being phased out of support by EMS. You can do basic level tasks such as setting antivirus, schedules, Windows updates, general things like that, but if you want to enforce sort of password policies, compliance policies, anything like that, they're not really supported in EMS anymore because it is an outdated system. Microsoft are trying to encourage people to move to Windows 10, which has the most amount of features that you can customize within EMS. Secondly, is BYOD in use? So you have to ensure that the policies you set for the BYOD users do not conflict with their personal data. So you don't want to restrict the devices too much that they can't access their own personal data on their device. The other end of the scale is you can force users to enroll in Intune so your company has their own corporate data protected and it forces the user to have that, otherwise they can't access Office 365. Now to some extent we would recommend to do this because at the end of the day you don't want any of your corporate data to be stolen. However, you don't want to restrict the users on their own devices. And again, any corporate data on the device, is the user going to be having their OneDrive data stored on there or their emails? Again, with EMS, you can actually do application management to secure the individual applications on the device, or you can just secure the device as a whole. Does the customer currently use Office 365? So, if they don't use Office 365, then a tenancy will need to be set up because the EMS application is hosted within Azure and that requires an Office 365 tenant. They don't actually need to purchase any Azure services or any other Office 365 services, but they will need to purchase the EMS licenses. Even if they do use Office 365 but they don't use all features, so for example if a customer only uses SharePoint, you can still use EMS with that and you can just protect the SharePoint data. Alternatively, if they just use it for Exchange, then you can just protect the mail data. There are specific Intune only licenses that can be purchased, so if you don't fancy spending a lot of money on say the Microsoft 365 Business or E3 licenses, because you don't need to utilize all those features included within it, you can buy a standalone Intune license just by itself to manage just devices. What operating software is being used? So again, we need to define what operating software the devices are using. If you've got a customer just using Windows 7 machines, then we probably wouldn't recommend using EMS. However, if they've got primarily Windows 10, iOS and Android, then it's definitely a good choice. Ensure they're all compatible with the Intune enrollment. So with iOS devices and Android devices, EMS only supports the latest version of their operating software. So for example, iOS 11 and Android, I think we're up to Android 8 now. Whereas some of the older ones, because Microsoft are constantly updating the app for Intune, it stays with the latest versions of these operating systems, and therefore you need to make sure that the device you have is compatible with that. Again, are these systems up to date? For example, iOS 7 will not work with it. The same with Android version 3. Out of date operating software and devices, it's not going to be compatible with the Intune app. So if there's a customer using a lot of legacy equipment, it would be worth performing sort of a hardware audit before rolling out EMS. How do they authenticate? Do they use multi-factor authentication? If so, that combines with EMS very, very nicely. If they don't use it, again, you can set it up within EMS just to be used for any of the devices that need to be secured. Do they log in to Windows with their Office 365 credentials? So with the latest version of Windows 10 Enterprise, you can actually sign into the device using your Office 365 credentials. You can perform restrictions within EMS to only allow the devices to be logged in with those credentials, or you can allow local accounts to be stored as well. Are there any VPN users? So one of the good features of EMS is you can actually set up VPN and Wi-Fi profiles within the policies. So if you've got a VPN connection for your customer's environment, you can put it in the actual EMS policy, and when the end user registers a new device, it will automatically push that policy out to that device, so they don't need to do any setup themselves. So who is the target audience? So, for example, educational customers have completely different requirements to government agencies. So, for example, government departments may require a very strict password policy with devices being encrypted and fully locked down, only accessible within inside their corporate network. Whereas educational customers, for example, if staff are working from home, they'll need access to their emails and their password policies may not be as strict. Ensure any compliance documentation is reviewed before you implement it. So for example, some of the government agencies will have, again, specific compliance rules that will be listed by their auditors, and you need to ensure that those documentation is read and ensured that it can be used within EMS before deploying it. Understand any special requirements. You may have a customer who has 10 different departments. One of them needs to be unrestricted and the rest need to be fully locked down. So you just need to understand that if there are any specific special requirements, because when you go to create the policies, you don't want to create one generic policy for the users, you'll need to create several of them. And that is the end. Thank you very much for your time.